When a grown-ass name drops a woman, and this is a woman to sell an album, when I was the only person in your artist corner when everyone turned their back on them. I think as artists, we all look back on things that we shouldn't have done. And that was one of those things that he shouldn't have done. And I told him,
I'm at a point in my life, like, we all grew up in the streets.
Hey, what's up, King Son? Man, you doing it, man. You deserve it, Daddy. You putting in that work. Proud of you. I love you. Yeah.
What makes this moment feel so unsettling is not just who was speaking, but how calmly it was said. A former bodyguard, someone who claimed he had been behind those guarded doors, sitting there on camera and hinting that once Meek Mill stepped into Diddy's orbit, the cost of that decision may have followed him long after the music stopped. And then there is the woman closest to the fallout, the one who did not react like someone upset over a petty vacation argument, a birthday mood, or a passing misunderstanding, but like someone who had seen enough to quietly reach an ending in her own mind. According to the theory that has been circling for years, Nicki Minaj did not create distance over a surface level dispute.
Meek Mill's got to deal with what he got to deal with based on the relationship him and Puff had.
She allegedly pulled away because of something she saw, something that changed the emotional temperature instantly and made the entire relationship feel different from that point forward. That is where the story begins to feel less like celebrity gossip and more like a locked room people keep describing without ever fully opening, because the whispers are not just about awkward nights or private tension, but about footage, archives, records, and materials some claim never really disappeared at all.
I don't want to be dead. I don't want to be in jail. I want 100. Just gangster, nigga. Buy your mother's son. Buy your grandma's son. It's easy to pull the trigger, but it ain't easy to move your mom out the hood. That's a real man job.
If even a fraction of that speculation is true, then her decision to separate her belongings, cover her own expenses, and walk away from that trip starts to look less impulsive and far more deliberate, like the final move of someone who had already connected the dots in silence. And that is what makes the image linger. Before any of the viral clips, coordinated appearances, or flashy celebrations blurred the picture, Meek Mill felt like something rare in that world. Raw, unfiltered, and undeniably real. He was not introduced as a polished industry invention, but as a young man from North Philadelphia carrying years of pressure, setbacks, and survival into every verse. Rapping like music was not just ambition, but the only exit he could still see.
I don't know if everybody been to Philadelphia, but it's an environment where, we got pockets where like it's ruthless environments, where neighborhoods, where like drug-infested neighborhoods, and being in a certain area, I caught a case at 19 years old, which I was falsely accused of a bunch of things, and I was put on probation for 10 years. And I'm 31 years old now, and I'm still on probation, basically. So,
10 years?
Yeah, it extended. Like, if anything happened, like, you don't have to commit crime, but if anything happens along the way, they can just add years and years and years. So it actually got extended to 16 years now. So I get out of probation in 2023, so if I was the loiter or get a traffic ticket, I could go to jail for years.
His legal battles gave that image even more weight, especially when his 2017 prison sentence over technical probation violations turned him into a symbol of a justice system many believe was deeply broken. He did not have to invent struggle to earn sympathy. The public watched it happen in real time, and that authenticity became the one thing no machine could easily duplicate. But sometimes, that is exactly what draws attention in rooms built on control, because the industry often does not just reward what is real, it studies it, circles it, and decides whether it can be reshaped into something more useful. And once that possibility enters the frame, the question stops being what Meek wanted from that world and becomes something far darker.
Meek Mill's got to deal with what he got to deal with based on the relationship him and Puff had. Dressing alike, being cozy, Puff calling him daddy, saying little innuendos to him. People are looking at that and saying Meek Mill is wrong for saying no Diddy. But you can't tell a man how to spend his money and how to make love to his wife or his Diddy.
What that world may have wanted from him. What makes this next layer even more difficult to ignore is the quiet shift in power hiding beneath it. Because in spaces like this, authenticity is not just admired, it is treated like currency, something rare enough to be leveraged, shaped, and in some cases, quietly redirected. The artists who feel the most real often become the most valuable, not simply because of their talent, but because their story cannot be easily replicated. And that kind of credibility opens doors that polished images never could. And according to the narrative that has been unfolding in fragments, Meek Mill may have represented exactly that kind of access.
And Diddy could promise a producer, if he's in a homosexual, that he could give him a Grammy. What kind of power, who he doing, or what he know, that he could get that done? That's some kind of spooky shit. No disrespect. That's real spooky, if he could promise somebody. And good thing the kid didn't believe him, because if the kid would have believed him, he might have got his booty hole tore up. So my whole thing about it is, listen here, man, he has to have some real power, but he showed us his power. Remember at the BET Awards? Remember when they was trying to go to commercial? And he said, nah, we not go. Whoever done that, bruh? Whoever stopped the people from going to commercial? Nobody ever did that but Diddy, bruh. So he had some kind of power at one time.
An artist whose voice carried weight in places where industry influence alone would fall flat. The theory suggests that Diddy did not just see a musician, he saw a bridge into communities that had grown resistant to anything that felt manufactured, a way to step into spaces that only responded to something earned the hard way. But here is where the dynamic becomes harder to pin down, because the same opportunity that looks like elevation from one angle can feel like entanglement from another, especially when the person offering it understands how to frame the exchange in a way that feels like empowerment. And that subtle inversion, where the key starts to believe it controls the door, may be where everything quietly begins to shift. As the story deepens, the names attached to it begin to carry more weight, and one of those names is Gene Deal, a figure often referenced not as an outsider looking in, but as someone who once stood close enough to observe the mechanics of that world firsthand. His perspective, at least in public discussions, is often framed less like a sudden revelation and more like a pattern he believes has repeated over time, which adds a different kind of tension to everything surrounding it.
It's crazy that money, that lifestyle, and you trying to fit into something get you. These guys never set out to do all this shit. Meek Mills, when he got into the game, he didn't set out to be questioning about his manhood with Diddy. But he put himself in that position.
Because if this is not an isolated situation, then it raises a more unsettling possibility about how influence is built and maintained behind the scenes. Diddy's rise, as many have described it, was never slucha or accidental. It was strategic, rooted in understanding what people wanted most and positioning himself as the one who could provide it. And for someone like Meek Mill, navigating legal pressure, public scrutiny, and the constant threat of being pulled backward just as he was trying to move forward, the idea of protection would not just sound appealing, it would feel necessary. But that is where the narrative takes a sharper turn, because what is offered as protection can sometimes come with conditions that are never fully explained up front. And by the time those conditions become visible, the situation may already be far more complex than it first appeared. Then comes the moment that seemed to ripple through the industry in early 2024, when Rodney Jones, a music producer, filed a lawsuit that introduced claims and descriptions that many observers say shifted the tone of the conversation almost instantly. Within that filing, there is mention, presented as allegation, not confirmed fact, of a Philadelphia rapper connected to Nicki Minaj, described in a way that has led many to draw their own conclusions about who it might be. And what made that detail stand out was not just the implication itself, but how it was framed, not as a private connection, but as something allegedly presented to others.
They came recently. This happened a long time ago, but they recently just made a statement that they found loads of cocaine. I wonder what they did with the cocaine, because they didn't turn it over to the police. They said they found loads of cocaine, razor blades. They said that the sheets were bloody, nasty. They found a whole lot of used condoms. And it was a Diddy party, given in Meek Mill's honor for his birthday. I was like, yo, wow.
Almost like a demonstration of what could be gained by aligning with the right figure. If that interpretation holds any truth, it introduces a deeply uncomfortable question about whether success in those circles sometimes comes tied to expectations that are never spoken openly, only implied through example. The promise of a Grammy in that context begins to feel less like recognition and more like a symbol, something used to represent access, validation, and arrival, while quietly obscuring whatever might sit behind it. Because in environments built on leverage, rewards are rarely just rewards.
You really don't know what was said, but the kid said he told him, this is somebody I admire, this is somebody you got high aspirations for, that you want to be like. Look and see what he doing. This is what you should be doing too. Wow, that was crazy.
They are signals, markers of an exchange that may carry far more weight than what is visible on the surface. And once that realization starts to settle in, the entire situation feels less like an opportunity and more like a negotiation where the true cost is only revealed after the deal is already in motion. What makes this part of the story feel almost impossible to shake is how the tone changes from opportunity to something that begins to resemble quiet control. Because according to the circulating claims, the real exchange was never centered on money at all, but on something far more intangible and far more difficult to reclaim once given.
Heard about this being shopped around, a Diddy and another Mill? They say the other Mill is an A-list celebrity.
I would wonder if he's white or black. And if I'm looking at any black guys that are A-listers that's bigger than Diddy, is only one that I could come up with. And there's a few I could come up with. Will Smith, he's bigger than Diddy. I would think Nick Cannon is bigger than Diddy. Who else on the black, that are black actors or black in the business, that's an A-lister that's bigger than Diddy, that's black? That's hard to think. But then if you got the A-listers, you know, you got to realize he ran with that black, that Rat Pack. And I don't want to even say their names, because they said I got their names wrong last time. What's his name? Kushner? What's the other guy? Leonardo? Yeah, his name. Man, I don't keep up with these cats. But I heard that that's not only the tape that's being shot. There's some other tapes out there, other people too with him. And him doing some things with some other people.
In the lawsuit filed by Rodney Jones, there is an allegation that stands out not because it is confirmed, but because of how it is described. A statement reportedly made not in secrecy, but almost as a demonstration, a way of signaling influence rather than hiding it. If that interpretation holds any weight, then the implication becomes less about a single moment and more about a method, a way of showing others what alignment inside that circle might involve before they even realize they were being measured. And that is where the atmosphere shifts again, because what looks like inclusion on the surface can begin to feel more like initiation when viewed from a different angle. Some observers believe this is how loyalty is shaped, not through contracts alone, but through experiences that quietly redefine where the boundaries are. And once someone senses that line has already been crossed, the idea of stepping back out may no longer feel as simple as walking away, which leaves a lingering question hanging in the air. At what point does participation stop being a choice and start becoming something else entirely? As more details from different voices and interviews continue to circulate, names like Gene Deal reappear, often framed as someone pointing to a broader pattern rather than a single isolated situation, which adds another layer of unease to the conversation. Because if what is being described is not a one-off event, but part of a larger, unspoken understanding, then it suggests a system that has been operating quietly in the background for far longer than most people realize.
A lot of the people that been in those parties and seen probably some unscrupulous that went down and was like, ooh, I was there. I hope they don't got me on tape. They feeling a certain way, so they're not gonna speak on nothing until they've been approached with something. You gotta realize, when Homeland Security get their evidence together, they're gonna send agents out. You understand? They might send an agent out to me. Yo, what do you know? What have you heard? What have you seen? What's been going on? You know what I'm saying? You know, did this happen when you was around him? Did this happen back in the day? That's what they're gonna wanna know. You know what I'm saying? So they're gonna send investigators out. They're gonna send people out for anybody that they can get some information from to help their case. So those celebrities ain't gonna say nothing. You know, you got your man Stevie J speaking on it right now. He'll be one of the first dudes that they'll probably pull to the side and say, yo, well, you say that your man, I heard you on TMZ say that he never did this and he never did that, but ain't this you? If those pictures or those films or anything like that exists. You know what I'm saying? That's what they pay those agents to do. So, of course, I don't believe that none of the people who are his celebrity friends is going to speak or say nothing until they're either contacted or they know what they really got.
So you feel like they might be worried that they might be on tape at one of Diddy parties doing something they wasn't supposed to be doing?
I think that the celebrities that may be worried is because what Lil Rob said. Lil Rob said in his affidavit that Diddy had every room taped and bugged. Diddy had, yo, bro, can you imagine he had every room taped and bugged, and they found little bugs or little tape recorders, little those micro projectors or whatever like that, or video cameras. They found them in the house, bro. So by them having those things in the house, and people know there's drugs, there's alcohol, there's loose women, there's loose men, woman on woman, man on man.
In that context, moments that once seemed random, the coordinated appearances, the viral clips, the strangely timed visuals begin to take on a different tone, as if they were fragments of something more deliberate rather than spontaneous snapshots. Some interpretations even suggest that documentation played a role, not necessarily for public release, but as a form of leverage held privately, a way to ensure that everyone involved understood the weight of their position without needing it to be spelled out. That possibility alone is enough to shift how the entire narrative feels, because it introduces the idea that certain moments were never meant to be seen casually. They were meant to be remembered strategically. And if that is true, then what looked like ordinary industry behavior may have been serving a very different purpose beneath the surface. Then there is the story of that Las Vegas birthday gathering, a moment that, on paper, reads like any other high-profile celebration, yet continues to resurface in discussions for reasons that go far beyond the guest list or the setting. Reports and secondhand accounts have painted a picture that feels inconsistent with a typical event, describing details that, while unverified, have been repeated often enough to keep the conversation alive. It is important to approach these claims carefully because they remain allegations rather than confirmed facts. But even so, the imagery they create has proven difficult for people to ignore. The suggestion that elements of that night may have been structured in advance, that certain aspects were controlled or monitored, introduces a level of intention that transforms the entire atmosphere of the event. And when you place that idea alongside the broader narrative, the claims of influence, the talk of documentation, the emphasis on perception, it begins to feel less like a single evening and more like a piece of a much larger puzzle. Because if even part of that structure existed, then the celebration itself may not have been the main focus at all, but rather the setting for something else entirely.
Everybody kind of knew back in the day that Meek Mills and Puff was a little too friendly. Anytime two rappers or two people in the industry come dressed up alike on more than one occasion, listen here, man. My dudes in Philly, I got some real strong dudes in Philly. They don't play that. And they probably embarrassed for the fact to see that Meek Mills, one of the street guys that came out of there, got caught up in this Hollywood shit.
Something designed to leave a lasting imprint long after the music faded. And just when it seems like the story has reached its limit, another layer emerges. Accounts from individuals who claimed they were close enough to hear or observe fragments of what unfolded, each adding their own version of events without ever fully aligning into one clear picture. Some of these accounts suggest that the environment may not have been as transparent as it appeared, raising questions about how much control any one person actually had over what was happening around them. Again, these remain unverified perspectives, but their consistency in tone is what keeps drawing attention back to them, as if multiple voices are circling the same idea without directly confirming it. If those perspectives hold even partial truth, then the narrative begins to shift from speculation about isolated incidents to something more systemic.
I'm at a point in my life, like, we all grew up in the streets, and we try to be better, but they labeled us felons, sent us back to jail. I had to fight against that the whole time.
Something that relies on silence and ambiguity to function, and that is where the tension reaches its peak, because the most unsettling part is not what is being said outright, but what continues to be implied between the lines. An unspoken understanding that whatever happened in those spaces may have been far more calculated than anyone initially realized. What makes this chapter feel heavier than everything before it is the quiet implication that this was never about discovering the truth. It was about containing it, because when Meek Mill publicly offered a large sum to private investigators, some didn't interpret it as curiosity, but as urgency, like someone trying to track something already in motion rather than uncover something hidden. The narrative that has been building around this moment suggests he may have already understood what existed and where it might lead, which shifts the entire tone from defense to damage control. And then the conversation widens, because voices like Gene Deal begin to reappear, describing, at least from his perspective, the existence of recordings that have allegedly moved beyond private possession into circulation, spoken about not as whispers, but as assets changing hands in places most people will never see.
That's all right. They go to the cash register. Meek only had cash on him. He tell Nicki, yo, just handle that real quick. I got you though. Nicki, she's a little bit bougie. She looks at him, and this is a toxic to say. She looks at him and says, I gotta pay for this? Man, Drake would never let me do something. That set Meek off, who's probably already on some shit. I hear she pays for her shit, she separates his, pays for her shit, hops in a car, and...
If even a fraction of that is accurate, then the gravity of it becomes difficult to overstate, because the Discussion is no longer about a single individual or a contained situation, but about names, recognizable, influential, deeply embedded names that would reshape public perception overnight if ever brought fully into the light. That possibility alone may explain why nothing concrete has surfaced in the legal sense, because when the stakes expand beyond one story and begin to threaten an entire network, silence can become the most valuable strategy of all. But what makes this even more layered is how differently it is perceived depending on where you're standing. Because while industry circles often operate within controlled narratives and carefully managed optics, the perspective from places like Philadelphia carries a completely different weight. There, the conversation is less about headlines and more about identity, about who someone was before the fame, and whether that version still exists underneath everything that followed.
Try to steal the he bought her. You heard why she left him? Because she picked up his phone and saw him with Diddy in the phone. That's why they broke up. They broke up because of Diddy. A lot of people don't know this.
For some observers, the disconnect is not rooted in judgment over personal choices, but in the perception of change. Whether someone who once stood as a symbol of resistance now appears to have moved in ways that feel harder to reconcile with that image. And that emotional shift, whether fair or not, tends to linger longer than any single allegation because it speaks to something deeper than controversy. It speaks to expectation. Meanwhile, Meek's public responses, especially online, have been analyzed in countless ways, with some interpreting them as frustration, others as pressure, and a few as something closer to urgency, as if every word carried more weight than intended. It creates a strange contrast. A man who once challenged systems openly now navigating a situation that feels far less visible, but potentially just as complex, if not more so. And then, almost quietly, the focus circles back to someone who had already stepped away long before these conversations reached their current intensity.
And I felt so imprisoned in that moment. I think as artists, we all look back on things that we shouldn't have done. And that was one of those things that he shouldn't have done, and I told him before he did it. But he did it, and it is what it is.
Nicki Minaj, a figure who, according to many interpretations, did not wait for public confirmation or collective opinion before making her decision. Her exit, when viewed through this lens, begins to feel less like a reaction and more like a conclusion she reached privately, based on something she understood that others are only now trying to piece together. That contrast between someone who left early and someone still responding in real time adds an emotional undertone that is difficult to ignore because it suggests two completely different ways of handling the same unseen reality. And just when it feels like the story has stretched as far as it can, one final idea settles in, almost like a closing echo. Surviving something does not always mean escaping it. Sometimes it means carrying it, quietly, indefinitely, long after the moment itself has passed. And if that is true here, then the real story may not be what happened back then, but how far its shadow still reaches now. What lingers long after everything else fades is not the noise, but the silence she chose. Because Nicki Minaj did not exit like someone caught in a moment. She moved like someone closing a chapter she had already finished in her mind long before anyone else realized it was ending. No confrontation, no spectacle, no carefully timed message to control the narrative. Just a quiet separation that felt almost surgical in its precision, as if every emotion had already been processed somewhere far away from public view.
Trying to really stay to myself. I was gonna go a full year without dating, period.
Yeah. And then somebody walked, who walked into your life?
No, I think, well, Nas.
Nas.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And then, but the good thing about the Nas situation is that he and I are still good friends, and we still have so much respect for each other. And I told Meek this, actually. I said, don't you see how Nas carried himself? I said, Nas has never once said anything bad about me. He's never done anything negative toward me. He carried himself like a king. And I, you know, I think that Meek learned a lot from that situation too, you know, because I had a lot of anger and hate for him because of the way he handled the breakup publicly. And I know he was hurt, you know, he was like, look, this was my first time being in love and I didn't know how to handle it. And at a certain point, you have to forgive, you know?
Gotta forgive.
And I have forgiven him because he has come genuinely to me and asked for my forgiveness.
Yeah.
But there are other people who attempt to use what I was in their life as a marketing ploy and to get attention, and I can't be with that. I put in real work, and I've helped so many freaking people, and that's why if you look around, there was a particular time on social media, a lot of people was running their mouth. None of them made charts since.
And that detail changes everything, because according to the perspective many have pieced together, this was not about something she heard through rumors or glimpsed through secondhand accounts. This was something she allegedly witnessed herself, something that aligned too perfectly with a growing feeling she could no longer ignore. The subtle changes, the moments where familiarity seemed to slip, the unspoken tension that appeared whenever certain circles were involved, all of it, in that interpretation, converged into a single realization she could not unsee.
When a grown-ass name drops a woman, and this is a woman to sell an album, when I was the only person in your artist corner when everyone turned their back on them. And I went and sat down in a meeting with Obama, President Obama. Ross was there and texted, this chick is a keeper. She went in a room full of rappers and spoke to Obama, and the first thing out of her mouth was about you. And then you come out on an album when it's time to sell some weak ass fucking and try to disrespect Nicki Minaj? What?
And once that realization settled in, the relationship may have stopped being a question of love and started becoming a question of distance, of how far she needed to step back to protect the version of herself that still felt untouched by whatever that world carried. What makes her response even more striking is not what she expressed, but what she chose to leave unsaid, because in situations like this, silence can often carry more meaning than any direct statement ever could. She did not attempt to rewrite the past or soften the edges of what she experienced. Instead, she framed it in a way that suggested closure without correction, forgiveness without denial. And that distinction matters because forgiving someone for your own peace is very different from dismissing what happened altogether. Some observers have pointed out that she never publicly challenged the core of what she saw, never labeled it as confusion or misinterpretation, which leaves a quiet space in the story that no explanation has fully filled. That absence of contradiction creates its own kind of tension because it allows the possibility, however unconfirmed, to remain intact. And in a world where narratives are often managed down to the smallest detail, choosing not to clarify something can feel just as intentional as making a statement outright. It is the kind of restraint that suggests understanding, but also finality. Like someone who has already accepted an answer, they no longer feel the need to debate. Meanwhile, Meek Mill's reaction, viewed through this same lens, begins to feel like part of a larger pattern, especially when moments that could have remained private were instead brought back into the spotlight in ways that some interpreted as strategic rather than emotional. The decision to reference her publicly, particularly in a context that turned personal history into something performative, added another layer to the narrative that is difficult to ignore. Because when someone who once shared that level of closeness becomes part of a public message, it raises a question about whether the lines between personal truth and public image have started to blur. And for those following the story, that moment did not feel isolated. It felt connected, almost like an echo of a system that repurposes everything it touches into something usable. If that interpretation holds any weight, then it suggests a transformation that goes beyond one relationship and points towards something broader, something that reshapes how people present themselves once they are fully inside that environment. And that is where the story settles into something deeper than speculation, because it leaves behind a question that does not resolve easily. If someone with visibility, influence, and awareness chose to walk away quietly, What might that say about the experiences of those without the same ability to step back? The industry may label moments like this as complicated breakups or personal differences, but sometimes an exit is not about conflict. It is about preservation, about recognizing a shift before it fully takes hold. And if Nicki Minaj's departure was, as some believe, rooted in that kind of realization, then her silence may not be avoidance at all, but intention, because the most unsettling part is not what has been said or even what has been implied. It is the possibility that there are still pieces missing, details that remain deliberately unspoken, lingering just beneath the surface. And if those pieces ever came fully into view, they might not just change how one story is understood, they could reshape how all of them are seen. Comment below with what you think is really going on. Leave a like if this gave you chills, and subscribe, plus turn on notifications if you want to see more Hollywood secrets.